work session started. Cinco's here to go over the meeting on the SAP project oversight. Appreciate you being here. Mr. Tim, over to you, sir. Okay, go identify yourself for the record first. Forrest, go identify yourself.
Forrest Dunbar.
Pete Peterson. Eric Cross.
Don Weddleton.
Big training.
Alden Third.
Sig Versions.
Barbara Jones.
Okay. Let's get started, Jake.
Okay.
Sorry we're late.
It's okay. So this is our May report. Kind of moving along, so it will. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the overall project progress. I do have a last minute update. My point for the last 3 months has been that plan is not real, that it doesn't represent reality, that everybody recognized at some point in time that we're not going to make 7-3. And everybody said, okay, what are we going to do? And so they said, we're going to shoot for 10-1. That's fine and dandy, but the point is the master plan was never updated, never generated. Everybody's been working against, in essence, an unreal schedule, which I find disturbing. Been talking about it, been trying to say, where is it, when are we going to get it? I understand that not more than 10 minutes ago I learned that there has been a plan actually generated and it's in review right now. So that is a positive step, that there's actually a plan that SAP has generated. But you can see on this thing, it shows they're behind. Even if you stretch it out to 10-1, they're still behind. So that's basically what this talks about. And then the team has been tracking unrealistically for nearly 3 months now. So even with this extension of 10-1, I'm suggesting to you that you still have some risks of not even making 10-1 if you don't get that schedule out there and start having people work against the plan. So the OCM team, which is Organization Change Management, for those of us who remember those terms from the last month's report, have already indicated they've gotten a new senior manager, and they've already assessed it, and they've already said, we can't finish developing training material until 10-5. Needless to say, that got some people concerned. And they're addressing it. I mean, they're basically saying, okay, we got to do some changes, and I'm going to talk about what some of the changes are that the OCM team is going to be doing. But certainly, you can't go turning the system on without having a situation where people are not trained on how to use it. And that gets to be pretty important. Some other things that are happening that are indicating some risks of even making 10-1 is that the performance testing team hasn't even been planned yet in detail, and there's no team leader identified for the performance testing. I asked the SAP folks whether or not we even needed to do it, and they were pretty adamant that had to be done. User acceptance testing is kind of the last approach, the last piece of testing. That's the one that SAP is going to basically say, if you approve, we're done. And that's what they're going to be looking for, and we certainly need to be planning that and deciding how we're going to go forward and accomplish the user acceptance testing. There's an awful lot of change out right now of project staff. That it adds to the risk of potentially missing 10-1. And we're actually having some changes in project leadership, also affecting the risk of potentially not making 10-1. And we've had this continuing months-long negotiation with SAP with regard to issuing and signing a change order to their existing contract. That has continued to be a sore spot. My understanding is that the Muni has taken its position, has written a change order, have reviewed it, gotten an understanding with SAP. They have signed it and have given that thing back to SAP for the last couple of months, and they still haven't signed that thing. And they keep coming back with some very troublesome phrases in the contract. Things like they don't want to get sued. Okay? You can understand why they might say that, but I think the Muni is taking a pretty strong position on that.
Although we get around to questions, I want to ask you, what resources we have to make sure they sign it? Or what's happened if they don't sign it?
Would you like to answer that question now? I mean,
No,
the mayor's
I'll wait till
here
he's done.
as well in the back.
Give you a few minutes to formulate it. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay. So, for the last couple of months now, I mean, I just presented this and let you know that it's there. This is kind of like what does Zico Consulting think can happen in order for you to accomplish a 10-1 go live. And so it's just a high-level plan using SAP's numbers, using their estimates and their hours and their elapsed times to generate a plan. I did this 2 months ago. It can be done. So here's an interesting picture. That isn't a real person. That's Dr. Parkinson. Have you ever heard of Parkinson's Law? Parkinson's Law says work expands so as to fill the time available for the completion of that work. The thing that the team has to watch out for is as you start continuing to push that target date out further, they tend to become more and more inefficient because they tend to start expanding the time, expanding the work to fit the time. Does that make sense? So there are some indicators that this is happening. The issues log. I mean, the team is doing the right thing. They're tracking issues and risks on a log, and they put assignments in there on who's supposed to fix the issue or resolve it. And what's the target date? Well, that's fine, except that the issues on the log get deferred dates about as often as the issues are closed. So things are continuing, I think I've used this term before, things occasionally seem to be, the team occasionally seems to be kicking the can down the road. Okay? Many risks on the issues log are merely in a watch status. This one drives me nuts. Okay, it's a watch status, and it's got a date that's months in the future. And I'm sitting there asking myself, what in the world are they watching? If you identify a risk, in theory, you do one of two things. If you identify a risk, you mitigate the risk, or you accept the risk. You don't just watch it. I mean, you got to do one or the other. And if you accept the risk, then so be it. You're going to say, we're willing to accept that that's going to happen, and we're going to move on. But if you're going to mitigate it, then you need to say, well, this is what I'm going to do to mitigate it, and here's the target date of when I'm going to do it. And meanwhile, we have a lot of watch risks out there, and the target dates are meaningless. The master plan, I've said this, doesn't reflect reality, but apparently we now have one that's, so if I were talking to you next week, I'd have a plan to show you. OCM, I think again, this is an indicator of work expanding to meet the time available. OCM started out with a plan to deliver all training by 4/1/17. Then they said, okay, we're going to deliver only phases or levels 1, 2, 3 will be post go live. So they basically cut their work by a third, and said, we can do that by 7/3, which includes the delivery of the training. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, they can do levels 1 and 2 or phases 1 and 2 of training by 10/5. And notice that says development of the material. It doesn't say deliver the training. Okay? Indicators of work expanding to meet the time available. So how do we keep Parkinson at bay? I've used the word diligently up there, and I mean that very seriously. That the team needs to be more diligent. They need to really hang in there. If you're going to work with that issues log, you need to sit there and say, what are you going to do about fixing that? What's the target date? And then instead of sitting there and kicking the can down the road, they need to take action. Does that make sense? So we need meaningful target dates. We need to make assignments to individuals rather than groups. There's still a habit of the team to assign something to the finance group. Well, who is that? And so again, you have an issue there of not being very precise. Obtain individual commitment to both work estimates and target dates. There's a lot of that going on with the consultants. but it's not going on as much with the MOA staff. And it would make more sense, especially when you've got people that are overworked, spread thin. Hey, can you do this? When can you get this done? I'm not sure that's happening very well. Mitigate the risk on a timely basis. Track time reporting. There's been a lot of turnover with Alden's admin staff, and we end up with several weeks in a row sometimes when we don't get the actual charges and the time reports collected and reported, which they should do. Okay? So this is all about discipline and diligence. Okay, so what's the project team say with regards to its progress? Now there's a reason why I put that image up there. So as I have been doing, I've been tracking the team as it reports. The team reports the stuff in a much shorter period. I've been tracking it since the beginning. So my spreadsheet actually goes all the way back. It's amazing how much red is on the spreadsheet. And red is the issue. If there's an issue, this particular line item cannot hold to schedule or cost or scope. That's their reporting. So you can, at the very bottom, you can see overall, since January 1, the team overall says cannot hold to schedule, cost, or scope. Period. That's what they've said. That's what they've done every week since January 1. The other thing I wanted to highlight, the very first line is the financial team, Philo. And they had some hiccups right after the beginning of the year. They came back around, they turned green, and all of a sudden, bang, in the last 4 weeks, they're having problems. Okay? Examples of some of those problems are the FERC report does not tie out. And they're testing. The FERC report does not tie out. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Okay, utility has to have the FERC report tie out. From a regulatory perspective, it has to tie out to the penny. Okay, and it's not. It's got to get worked. But that's almost a showstopper.
So what's the report?
Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Oh, that one. Okay, yeah.
Okay?
I need that.
It's a big deal.
So let me, so when you
Yes,
say
John.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, John.
I want to see what that means. So they're pulling, there's data out there that they've been using for years. So now you're pulling that data, putting it in SAP, and running a report to see if you get the same answer or you're not getting the same answer.
Yeah, they're running tests. The reason why and I'm not surprised that it's happening, but the reason it's happening is that the utility had its own chart of accounts X years ago. All right? A decision was made 5 years ago, 4 years ago, that we're going to have a single standard chart of accounts. That single standard chart of accounts is the chart of accounts that's in SAP. So now you're taking information and data, and it was grouped and organized according to the FERC-oriented chart of accounts that the utility had. And now you're trying to run that through SAP, and you're following all the accumulations and so forth into a different set of accounts. And now from an SAP accounting perspective, I now need to restate those numbers in FERC structure, in the federally required accounting structure. Does that make sense? So it's basically a big cost accounting exercise. It wasn't me, good. So it's a big cost accounting exercise, okay? And so that's what's causing the issue. And they'll get it resolved. It's just, but it's important that they have to get it, and that's why it's showing red. That's one example of some of the things that are going on. They also had some problems with purchasing because, again, the new process with SAP is a 3-document match. So now you have to sit there and create, a purchase order has to match to a receiving document, has to match to an invoice. These are all relatively new things. And so those are all getting convoluted, if you will, in the testing.
Yes, John.
So Okay, so that's a good explanation, but the fact that they turn red, we shouldn't really be surprised, because as they go forward, they're gonna find little things, oh dang, that reportedly we didn't expect that.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem is, it's been 4 weeks. Testing has only got 2 more weeks of fix.
I'll answer a variety of questions before we go too far down here. So first off, there's a SIT2 is a 5-week SIT2 testing with 3 weeks of break fix. We're currently finishing up the 2nd week of break fix this week. What you're seeing there is that the FILO team did not have a SIT1. And if you remember, we had to de-scope almost all of the SIT1 FILO because the development wasn't completed at that point in time, whereas HCM was able to complete a vast majority of their scripts. As a result of that, this is almost the first time through that the entire FILO team has been able to go through all their scripts from beginning to end. And when you go through something the first time, you find a lot, second time a smaller amount, third time perfection, hopefully. So what you're seeing here is
That was a guarantee on.
yeah, I can make plenty of comments. The reason why we're red is I'm probably the most pessimistic person in the world, and I've told SAP we're going to make sure we never overstate how well we're currently doing. So you can see that as a bad, but I'm not making us green if we're not really green. I'll make us red and then justify why we're red, because we have, if you notice there, we've got a whole bunch of green boxes and we got 2 red. Those 2 red are important enough to me to keep the entire project red, because we have to be 100% across the line. But that just answers an earlier statement that was made. But obviously, when you start going through here, you get a lot of defects, you get a lot of things that are holding up FILO and so forth. And as a result of that, that's why the team said we got a lot to do. And the teams that have been validating, they're going, there's a lot of issues and so forth. So we did not want to underestimate the criticality of where we're at in that particular area. So we take it red to fairly represent what's going on. But that's because that was the 2nd or 3rd week of SIT testing when we started getting in there. Zig is absolutely right. We had the first 3 weeks, we had nothing but problems with SRM, which is our purchasing area. We brought in people to be able to do that, but there's been certain challenges, but that's because FILO, this is really their first time through, beginning to end, the vast majority of these things. If you look at HCM, they've been green all the way through because they've been ahead and had a lot more successes going on, and that's kind of where we're at that point.
Anything else, John, before I move on to Eric?
I'll wait till a little later in the presentation.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just see a couple of gray lines where there's no data available, data cleansing portal all the way across.
So data cleansing was something when we first did this over a year ago. That was one of the things that John Marcinko, our consultant, was going to be looking at when we wanted to see how good was our data for our very, very first SIT tests and all that kind of stuff. So we had a line in a category where that was being monitored, then that dropped off. Technically speaking, that one, and then portal was another area. Portal is the place in between when interfaces are going between the MOA and SAP. I was concerned that we needed to make sure we were watching it and how that progressed, but we are well beyond those 2 particular areas, so they're not reporting anymore because they're technically not even relevant, and those 2 lines shouldn't even exist. And I don't think they exist on the report
No, they don't.
that I send out.
But remember, I'm keeping this thing from the very beginning, which means the lines continue.
But understand, Mr. Peterson has a question because of that. It's not on my list when those particular things, but that's why they're great.
That's why I asked. Thank you.
Eric? Anything else, Eric?
Okay. I did circle a couple of items on there that I think is important to recognize. The SAP contract states it's valid and in place for 55 weeks or the number of hours that they have budgeted, whichever comes first. They have now reached the end. You can see they're beyond 55 weeks. SAP is now currently working at risk. They can't bill us for any of their time right now. So, and you'll see later, I mean, that means they're running at about $300,000 a week.
That's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
Can I ask, what does that mean, running at risk?
Go ahead.
Now's probably the appropriate time to answer the questions about what's going on and it dovetails into your question, Mr. Crop. So as you're aware, we've been trying to reach resolution with SAP on that investment for a long period of time. We even presented to you $6.3 million, and we were going to be doing this and that. We actually reached agreement on all those things, and then yes, just as we presented the documentation to sign and everything, they came in with 2 new clauses that said you can't sue us, and you also can't use derogatory comments against us.
So we can't state reality?
So let's just say that was not a pleasant experience, and we have been working on it for several months now, the mayor and myself. We still have not been able to get them to come back to reality on that, and as a result of that, the time has continued to go on, and what happened is exactly as Zig is saying, the 55-week on their original contract did end at that particular point in time, which means that all the money and all the hours that they had to be able to do that work were spent at that, or allocated, I guess is a better terminology, because you're aware that we haven't paid invoices in quite a while in SAP. So what they are doing is they're still trying to work to get this resolution of these change orders, but they have no commitment from us, nor money, nor hours to be able to do it. So they are working at risk. So if they were to pull out and leave, they couldn't bill us for week 56, 57, 58, as long as it goes until they go out. They have nothing signed with us that says that we're supposed to pay over a certain amount of money, and that money technically ended on the 55th week.
Mr. Croft, sir.
Can they just leave?
Well, I think they could probably pull out and leave if they so desired. We would have a very strong response, I'm sure, with regards to that, but they do not have a contractual, they do not have a contract in place or a change order or anything like that says that they have the money and or responsibility of working beyond that 55 weeks.
Well, you've seen these situations before. That's kind of the reason we hired you. What can you tell us about this situation?
So, a couple of things. One, we need to remember that it's a time and materials contract. Okay? If it were a fixed fee contract with specific results involved, included, then you certainly could keep them here, because contractually they would need to deliver or give you a product. Time and materials contract, they got to give you the hours, and they've done that. So, no, there's nothing really keeping them here other than any kind of promises that we might make or agreements that we might make for future work or additional work. I mean, then that would be an incentive for them to hang around. So yeah, they certainly can walk. Obviously, it's bad for them. It's bad for business. It's bad for their reputation. I mean, if they were to walk, I mean, it would be a real disaster for them in terms of their reputation and so forth.
Let me just second, I've got some people want to talk. Forrest?
I want to ask you quickly, is there really no reliance claim we could make, but I'll defer, is that what you're going to talk about?
I'll just say there's a covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and there's a reliance that's built into this. So I don't think it's as simple as this contract, the contract not being to the letter. I think there are a number of other implied contractual terms that would cover.
Forrest, anything else?
No, that was, the mayor spoke to it.
I would also
Other
add,
comments, questions from assembly members on this issue?
if I could, Mr. Trainee, we did put in a holdback of $1.5 million in the contract, so they couldn't bill us for all the money for 55 weeks, even if they wanted to and did walk, because in order to get that holdback money, they have to deliver, and they didn't deliver because they would be walking out. So there is they wouldn't even be able to get all the 55 weeks of money that they technically could say that they work. So when they're working at risk, that's the new stuff, but they can't even get all of the stuff that was there to begin with because of the way we orchestrated the contract to begin with.
Okay.
Anything else? Questions? Go ahead, Zig. Barbara, what time do we say this meeting was going to end?
I believe you have an hour for this.
Okay, good. Keep
And you
going.
can always have an extension, Mr. Chair,
We're gonna
there's not
extend.
a meeting following this.
Okay. So the last month, I think we talked about the fact that it's a good thing that the team is now tracking things on a daily basis, and the devil's in the details, and they're providing those details to Alden, which is a good thing. Here is the way they're reporting the paycheck parallel. One of the things that's going on in addition to SIT2, integration testing cycle 2, is they're also doing cycle 1 of parallel paychecks. Now, paycheck is, I'm calling it paycheck rather than parallel payroll. They call it payroll. The reason I'm calling it paycheck is because they're not testing from the capture of time through the time clocks to the payroll system to generate the check. They're simply taking payroll data from the PeopleSoft system to try to replicate the checks. That's what they're doing. So I've got a real hang up with the fact that they're not really including those, okay? But the good news is there's 2,900 round numbers, 2,900 employees, and 80% of those employee checks are within the acceptable matching criteria of $5. That's the good news. And this is first pass. That's a good thing. So, I mean, and that, and almost everybody on the team recognizes that they're really, quite frankly, that's pretty good. Okay? Now, mismatches are being reconciled at a very good pace. They started about 10 days ago, they started with, I think, about 800 checks that were not matching. They were beyond the $5. Most of it was because of the different ways that overtime is calculated in PeopleSoft versus the way overtime is calculated in SAP. And so those have all been cleared up and matched and reconciled, and almost all. And then I think we need to recognize that the next cycle, the criteria will be $2.50, and then the third cycle will be 50 cents. So they're moving forward, and in that sense, looks like they're doing pretty well. The Philo system, this is the team. This is the Philo team. The only thing I'm seeing here is that that line at the top is these are the scenarios that have been run by the technical team, and they are ready for the subject matter experts to validate. Okay. The not so good news is that they're spread thin. The subject matter experts are spread thin. They're doing a lot of different things, and they're really having trouble maintaining the pace because you can see the gap. There's a gap between the number of scenarios that are ready to validate on a daily basis versus the number of scenarios that are actually being validated. And once they're validated, that means they passed the test, and you're going to be okay. Make sense? Similar kind of thing with HCM, and we've talked a lot about the fact that the immunity folks there's a small list of people that are working on this thing. What is it, 12 or 15?
Well, there's 22 core, one of which is in the room right here. Thank you, Elizabeth. But there's a core 22. However, I would say that there's probably about 14 that are pretty much between HCM and Philo, full-time, dedicated, must-have people.
And they're just spread thin. And so it's causing this gap. I think the immunity folks are trying to do the best they can, but it's constantly, because you've got so many, we're talking about thousands of scenarios. It's a large number. The technical people keep spinning them through, and they keep coming out and saying, okay, validate this one. And it's just, there's a continuing gap. Okay? So, data quality has continued to be, and will probably continue to be an issue. However, I think it's important to, one, but don't pay attention to the real high peaks in that purple line because that's totals. The good news is that they're closing master data defects at about the same pace that they're identifying new ones. So they're maintaining pace. So it's the lines down at the bottom, they're basically identical. And so that's the good news, is that at least as you identify defects in data, they're getting fixed, they're getting resolved. Outstanding RISEs, if you recall, if you haven't seen this term, that represents basically all of the output of the system. W is work processes, R is reports, I is interfaces, C is customizations, E is enhancements, F is forms. And I think the important thing is to recognize that we still had some development work, some programming work, but the trend is the downward trend, which is exactly where you want it to go, right? You want to get those cleared off so you can test them. And so that's a good thing. I'd like to talk a little bit about project governance. You'll notice that we've got a revolving door there. So it's important to recognize that as we start getting near the end game here, we've had two different program managers. We had two different program managers during the blueprint, during the design phase. Okay? And then as soon as we moved into realization, we all of a sudden started changing program managers. And now we've had 4 different program managers throughout the actual development phase. The SAP calls that realization. It's configuration, development, and testing. Those things are all part of realization. But we've had four different program managers, and we've had 4 different SAP program executives since contract inception. So just saying that there's a lot of change going on at the upper echelon for the project as far as SAP is concerned. So some good news is the people right below the program manager are the senior project managers. So when you hear FILO, there's a senior project manager responsible for FILO. When you hear HCM, there's a senior project manager responsible for that. So they're not changing as often. That's a good thing. And I think it's important to note that the ones, if you may recall, when we looked at all the greens and yellows and reds, there were 2 on there that are very consistently green. HCM and development. And interestingly enough, those are the ones where the senior project manager has been there since the beginning. So you got consistency. They seem to be able to stay on top of the project, stay on top of what their area is. So here's some troubling news. SAP attempted to remove the existing FILO senior manager who has 2 years of corporate knowledge. He's been around that long. He knows the Muni. He knows the financial configuration. It's a resource that, quite frankly, is pretty important to the project. And if you'll recall, that was the one that's dipped down into red the last 4 weeks. So they tried to get that person replaced. I think the good move, the smart move was that move was averted. Okay, Alden was able to work a deal with them. So if they're going to bring somebody in to be the senior project manager, go ahead. But we want to keep this individual here. Okay, and so that's really a positive aspect of this whole thing.
Go ahead, John.
So I'm sorry, is that a municipal employee they tried to get rid of? Or is
No.
that
These are SAP folks. These are SAP folks. But the deal with SAP in the contract is anytime you want to bring somebody on, Uni gets to interview them and gets to decide whether or not they do. They try to pull this move off without even telling Alden.
Yes, Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are they trying to move him out because he knew too much?
Well, I'm not sure I'm in a position to say why they wanted to move him out. I think Alden might have some comments on that.
Well, I think if I was SAP, they'd say 2 things. One, they would say that this was a reduction in force that was done across the worldwide where they had to cut 1,000 people out, and he happened to be one of them. I would argue that there's a lot more people in that company that could have picked somebody else, but that was the first half of it. The other aspect I think you would see is as you see, FILO has kind of struggled all along through this entire thing. They are very concerned about the leadership and the leadership of that person over the individual consultants within that particular area, which is about 8 to 10 different consultants and his leadership capabilities. So they brought in somebody who has, they feel, a lot stronger leadership, but doesn't have any FILO background. So as Zig has stated, I expressed some displeasure with that, and we've been able to split the baby, so to speak, and keep them both. And we will get the best of both worlds going forward, hopefully.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Alden, sir.
Okay. So some more troubling news. We're in testing. We went through SIT 1. And as Alden mentioned, they call it de-scoping. In essence, in my opinion, they kicked the can down the road. They took a whole slew of scenarios and said, we can't get those done in SIT 1, we're going to go to SIT 2, which meant that they would be first time through in SIT 2, which is what they're experiencing right now. A lot more errors. Because the second cycle, you're supposed to have less errors because you're doing it a second time. So the actual leadership of SAP's perspective now on those, on training, on testing of SIT 1 and SIT 2, they've actually had, 3 different changes, 3 different people trying to run this thing. Okay? So it's a concern. All right? After nearly 2 years, so the organization change management senior manager, has been around for a long time, and he was replaced 2 weeks ago. So we've got a new person in there, and they're replanning this thing again. What the reasons are. I mean, the fact that you can sit there and say to yourself, well, why do we have to replan all those things? Why? Well, how is it that that senior manager was actually writing courses himself? He's supposed to be managing the team. So there's a lot of indicators there that this is probably an appropriate move. So, but there are project risks when you start having this much change in your leadership. You lose institutional knowledge, you lose the configuration knowledge, you get schedule delays, you get increasing costs, and you certainly continue to have morale issues. So those are all risks that need to be mitigated and addressed. So let's talk a little bit about preparing for training, because we are in the last 8th of the project, if you will. But you'll notice that the training podium is empty. So I see it as some revitalization, if you will, of the organization change management team. Got a new senior project manager, did the reassessment last week. He basically said, can't finish. I think I've already talked about that. So here's what he's in the process of doing. He's saying, okay, let's reduce the scope. But I think the main issue here, or the main action that he's taking, is he's actually moving some of the training to post-go live. So we're kind of kicking the can down the road again. But that's because the obvious thing to do it faster is to get more resources. So the odds are he's not going to get more bodies, but he's going to try. He's going to ask. He has worked towards improving the team's productivity and the way they actually put these things together and put the training courses together. Yes, he's going to be looking for more resources, and of course he's going to replan this thing so it matches what needs to happen. He's got a new way of showing the readiness of the organization. There's areas here of are the trainers prepared? Because we're going to train the trainers, and there's a whole list of things that he's focusing in on, which is good. And I think the positive thing here is that there's no red up there. Okay? However, I'm sitting there asking the question of where has our focus been? I'm hopeful that he will see this. I think he will. And this is where we get into this business of improving the productivity of his team. The focus, as you can see, is the very top line where we're focusing on the slides for instructor-led courses. And you can see that the small progress down on work instructions at the bottom. I circled that. Work instructions are the system documentation. Those are the procedures on how you do things. Instructor-led, PowerPoint presentations, fine and dandy, but you got to have your procedures. So I think we're going to see a shift there, as we should. So what are some of the impacts of where he's coming from? His statement, is that if you get these recommended adjustments, the team will be able to get the training, ready before go live. So we'll be able to push that from 10.5 for the development to 2 months prior to, which makes sense. I have seen a preliminary list of the courses and the work instructions that he has deferred or is recommending that they defer to post go live, and that's about 1,000 hours of work. So you do all the calculations, and that saves you almost 2 months worth of time. So it makes sense. It'll work. I want to remind everybody down at the bottom, however, is that, as we start talking about post-go live and we start moving things out there, that it starts increasing the amount of work after you turn the system on. Okay? So here's an example of some of the things, at least from a organization change management perspective need to occur, but these are all post-go live. Post-go live. So we need to have a training team, or you can call it a continuing center of excellence. That's an SAP term. We need to have some staffing. Who's going to do all this stuff? Because SAP, in theory, goes away. Complete development of the deferred instructor-led coursework material. I'm calling that Phase 2B. Complete Phase 3 work instruction development. Deliver Phase 2 and deliver quarter-end stuff near the quarter-end. Deliver month-end stuff near the month-end, and deliver training for CAFR preparation. You can do that in the first quarter of 2018. But this starts getting to be, if I were to estimate all this, it's probably 2,000 hours. So that's a person year after you turn the system on. So project cost. So here's an update on weekly hours. You can see we started in January around 1,500 weekly hours of total consultant time being reported to the project. We hit almost 3,000 last week. Okay, and the average is almost 2,600 hours per week. Per week. That's SAP folks. That's the folks in India. That's the folks in Mexico. Oops, I'm sorry. So this is the same chart that I just updated it. That based on from last month. You can the purple line or the blue line, whatever color we like to call that, the expenses, and the green are the fees. The weekly average now, since January, the weekly average is almost $500,000 a week. The average, 491,000. Notice that from the prior week, it's up $45,000. It really jumped in that last week. Okay, you can see it's almost $600,000 is how much was charged last week. And the reason I have that arrow there and the question mark is that, boy, where's this thing going to go? Okay. Now, as long as SAP's at risk, I suppose that's okay.
Stop learning my master plan.
This is just
to write your doctoral thesis on SAP.
This is just a repeat of the pie chart showing you the percentages of who's getting paid what. SAP is right at 73% of the total charges. But Peloton continues to be about 24,000. They're picking up about $100,000 a week. Was unable to adjust this. I don't have last month's totals for the project cost to date, so I couldn't update this. But to my thinking, there's very little that's happened that would change that projection of $78 million. And again, this is a projection of what the total cost would be in terms of incurred charges. Who pays for it and how it gets paid for is another issue entirely. In other words, if SAP ponies up some money, then obviously the out-of-pockets for the Muni would go down. It would not be that full 78. Make sense? But that's where we're at in terms of the numbers. I'll talk a little bit about contracting. So, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not sure exactly if John Marchenko should be on there, but contracts that will expire at the end of June. Because in other words, they were all set up for the July 3rd go live. So Peloton and Alaska IT, and I think Marchenko, but maybe not, basically will expire at the end of June. So, and then the contract that has expired is SAP's. So we need to recognize that SAP is working at risk, and the others are going to be paid, and they're going to work, and they're going to continue charging through the end of June. Needless to say, as we go forward, those agreements and those contracts need to be extended. Okay, otherwise they will stop working. So the actions are extend the contracts, suggesting you want to at least have them go through 10/1. You probably ought to want to fund the contracts through 10/30 because of any slop that's going to go over that date. The termination date, there's no reason why you can't make the termination date a little bit longer, so it gives you a little more flexibility, and you don't have to worry about updating that contract, okay? And then you certainly need to get SAP's concurrence with that major change order. And, you know, the bottom line is, best I can tell, the ball's in their court. Is that a fair statement, Mr. Mayor? It's in their court, right?
Absolutely.
There we go.
Yes, Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we decide to fund the contract through 12/31, does that send a signal that we're gonna move the start date back to the end of the year instead of the start of the third quarter?
No, I don't think it necessarily says that. I mean, I think it just gives you some flexibility so that if they run beyond 10/31, you don't have to sit there and make an adjustment to the contract. I'm not suggesting you fund it through 12/31. And in fact, if I were there, I would try to be getting SAP to commit to a delivery of a product in their change order rather than time and materials, because all they're doing is counting hours. That's all they're doing. So if it runs longer, they'll just say, "Oh, you got to pay us more because they're going to spend more hours." Okay.
Keep in mind the contract shall come to Pacific for approval.
Okay, so I've got a big what if here, and we talked a little bit about this before, and this is a little more detailed. They could terminate their involvement. SAP could terminate, right? They could walk. According to the contract, 30-day notice is required. Now, they could say, well, the contract is terminated, it doesn't apply, and we're just leaving. So they could. Odds are they wouldn't do that, because that immediately becomes grounds for breach of contract. So how long do we think that they'd be willing to work? I mean, I think we have to look at it from their perspective, because they've got executives who are sitting there and going, wait a minute, I'm cranking $300,000 a week. And they've got to pay their people. They're paying their people, so they're spending money. They're paying for the expenses right now. They can't bill anybody for it. So they're already about $1 million in. And at that rate, and if you sit there and say, I'm going to, if they were to give you that notice next week, then that's another 4 weeks. It takes you to July 4th weekend, give or take. And that would be another $1.5 million. So by July 4th weekend, if that's what they decide to do, they would be at risk for $2.5 million. Much less the $1 million that's the holdbacks. They don't get that. Now, the things that they have charged since November, at some point in time, the invoices will come in. At some point in time, the community is going to have to pay those, because that's contractual. Okay? But this stuff is all at risk. This is stuff that they are going to have to eat. So it becomes an interesting game of chicken between the Muni and SAP.
We've got about 4 minutes and we're reaching our
Okay, I'll move quickly on some of these things. I'm just repeating my comments about morale. I'm still concerned about those. We've already talked about the plan. Don't need to talk about those. We've talked about the change order. Don't need to say anything more about that, because we've got the master plan now, because the administration did that. Oh, excuse me. Page down. Whoops. I did, oh shoot.
Is that SAP driven thing?
No, the thing I think is really kind of amusing is SAP has trouble getting invoices out to everybody, right? Guess which system they're using to generate their invoices?
Their own system, yeah.
Uh-huh. I'm sorry about this. Let me go. There's a couple of things I really do want to try to cover with you.
42 was the last one that I had.
I'm trying to find, skip all this. Okay, looking beyond post-go live. So this is just kind of a list, and I alluded to it a little bit. Oh, what happened? There we go. I alluded to this last month, and I think these are all the items that need to be done after you go live. You need to recognize that there's just a slew of activity out there after you go live. So you're not finished when you go live. So there's this whole issue of the P card, making sure that you can process your credit cards. Muniverse, we've talked about this before, the tremendous number of queries that are actually set up in Muniverse that are not coming when you go live. Okay? Enterprise-wide standard queries, that's part of Muniverse. You got 32 or I think 32 reports that are simply not going to be addressed at post go live, so they have to be created. You've got this whole business of training, the courses that got deferred. ECM, if you'll recall, the enterprise content management is only doing, when you go live, you're only going to have ER, AP, and purchasing. Everything else is to be done. Okay? And then the CAFR. I mean, the contract says that SAP is supposed to give you generate the 10 reports for the CAFR. The problem with that one is if you look at the contract language, it says we'll give you 2,600 hours to do those reports. If they reach the 2,600 hours and the reports aren't done, we have a problem because it's a time and materials contract. Okay? So what I'm suggesting that the Muni should do is the Muni should establish a project with all of that stuff that we just listed. Establish a project. I suggest you better rename it. You don't want to call it the SAP project anymore. It's back to the original name, which is Synergy 2. Okay? Consolidate those items. If you do, you can call it a capital project, and you can depreciate it and treat it as you are other capital projects, which allows you to spread the cost. If you nickel and dime this thing and do each one as a little line item, then you're not going to get them as capital. Okay? So characteristics, SAP is no longer a prerequisite to do all that stuff. You're going to have people, you're going to have knowledge. You don't really have to have it. Now, you may want to do that because you may want to include them because it becomes an incentive for them and it's part of your negotiating tactics. The product, in my opinion, could be completed before next fiscal year. 6 months. No reason why you can't do that in 6 months. It's nowhere near as complex or as large in terms of components as what you're trying to finish now. You could use in-house staff, but you also could contract. If you use external, I'm suggesting you're probably looking at half of your current weekly rate. So if your rate's about $500,000 a week right now, easily can get this done for $200 to $250 a week. I don't know if Alden wants to continue. He's probably burned out. But the point is that you can probably, if you want to, certainly Alden can continue, or you could have the CIO be the project sponsor, Chief Information Officer. And then there is a project management office that's been established. They're supposed to be the ones that are responsible for all this stuff, so the new PMO would manage this whole thing. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when you're saying external resources, are you talking Peloton, or are we talking folks in India and Mexico?
There are, you're probably not going to have, that's the difference between what kind of organization you work with. If you work with SAP, you're going to get these offshore resources. If you get Peloton, they have none of that. It's going to be all lower 48 folks. Okay. But yeah, a little higher cost, but Peloton's rate is about 175 to 190. Is that right, Alden?
165 to 190 an hour is what we're paying for
Versus
Peloton.
SAP at 309.
309 is what we're paying.
Okay. And there are other firms like Peloton. There are plenty of firms like Peloton that can do that kind of thing. What we're back to, and you'll remember some of this, Dick, is I remember we talked earlier in this project 2 years ago about does the Muni want to be the general contractor? Okay, so you got somebody with big pockets, and you go one throat to choke. You got SAP, good. Go for the big kahuna. That's great. The smaller stuff, you can go ahead and be the general contractor. Bring in other smaller firms. So I wanted to ask this question: should you or should you not be looking at and thinking about a post-go-live audit? There are two types of audits. One of them is a cost audit, checking on how all the numbers got accumulated, because you need to have that so that you can sit there and say, this is the value that I'm going to capitalize, this is the value that I'm going to depreciate. You really need to feel good about that number. You really do, especially the size of what you've got. Okay? Performance audit is, does it do what it's supposed to do? Okay? Does it do what it's supposed to do? We've already talked, the cost audit is pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. The kinds of things that you do with a performance audit is you confirm whether or not the vendor contract is in compliance. Now, I don't have to tell you why that might be valuable to the Muni at this point in time. So you certainly want to confirm the implemented solution meets the expectations. This requires the auditors to go back and look at that design and say, okay, you're supposed to have these reports. These are the 93 interfaces. Do you have them or don't you? Okay. Determine new system acceptance. This is a survey which says, okay, now folks, do you understand how to use this thing? Did you get trained? Right? User controls. Is security working? Or people have access or don't have access that are supposed to have? There's going to be, and there should be, a service organization report that SAP must provide to the Muni to prove that all of that remote stuff that they're running for you is under control. It should exist. I've already suggested that the Muni request it. Okay? And there's a particular type. It should be type 2. Type 1, I've done these. Type 1 is a point in time. Type 2 is over a period of time. You obviously want a period of time. Okay? You want to confirm the results and the benefits, and you certainly want to have lessons learned, and you want to formalize those as you go forward. You don't want to. So here's an estimate of what it's going to take. This is not inconsequential. Not inconsequential. Okay? To do a cost audit anywhere from $225,000 to $400,000. Okay? The expenses are not as high as the performance audit because I'm presuming that you probably can get your external auditor to do this. So they're local. Okay? But the external auditor does not have a lot of good solid IT auditors, nor do you have any IT auditors internally. So the performance audit, you're probably going to bring in folks from down lower 48. And there's the estimate of how many bodies, how long it will probably take. It's pretty sizable, 480,000 to 864. And that's a range created by the fact that there's a range in the number of people and there's a range in the number of months.
Mr. Friends, ma'am?
So the performance audit, the intent of that would be to identify any issues that hadn't been identified, or just to evaluate how the system is working?
Yeah, I tried to allude to that. There's a lot of components to it and a lot of value that you can get to it, but the most important one was that first line. That first line that said, okay, let's talk about contract compliance. Okay, so that's going to get into what was promised, who was supposed to do what.
Okay, because that's a big number.
Yes, it is.
860.
Yes, it is. But here's an example of the kinds of things you need to do. I did one for the state of Colorado. I had 5 people, and we were on it for 6 months. Okay. One of the things that we had to do is we had to literally identify and scan every email processed by every member of the project team over a 4-year period. Yeah, we did searches, and we didn't read them, but if you've got a situation where things are not documented as well as they should be, and Alden and I have talked about that. When he started, things have been documented reasonably well. Boy, those first couple of years, when, as you recall, the mayor basically said we ended up throwing away $38 million, right? Well, that's part of the performance audit.
Okay. Basically, so
Possibly, you
that was the cost of this part?
Look at what he just said. We were spending $78 million.
Right.
Go ahead.
Would it be cheaper just to sue them and then make them prove the work?
I think you would be much better off and much better positioned if you were to have the results of a performance audit.
This said what it didn't do what it was supposed to do. That gives us more evidence when we go to court to sue.
Because
John?
It seems to me that we do a performance audit. go live and we find out, if the budget's not budgeted, payroll's not payroll, and capper's not capper, and purchasing can't purchase, that's our performance audit. No, we can't do this stuff, isn't that? And then we go back and complain. No, there's no better performance audit than that. It works or it doesn't, right?
Well, that's part of it. You get into, I mean, is it going to work? There's no question it's going to work. The question is, does it work the way it was supposed to work? That's what you get into. I mean, and all of the, there's a long litany of things that we know and we need to be able to prove in any kind of litigation situation. I keep talking about kicking the can down the road. I mean, when you've got a project manager, somebody the contract says you're supposed to be managing this thing, and you can sit there in a document and say, oh, you didn't have a project plan for 3 months. Huh? How can you call that management? I don't. Or you can go back to when they did their first project plan. I mean, you can go back and get all the emails that show when it was mailed back and forth, how long did they look at it, when did they do this, when did they do this, and you can look at various versions of that plan. I mean, those all exist. I've got it. It says, no, it took them 3 months to do a plan. Are you out of your mind? 3 months to do a plan? I mean, okay, they brag about how many task line items are in there, but I'm going, so?
But John, we're now at the end of the road almost. And we can't get it down because there's nothing at the end of the road. This thing's got to go live, it's got to be predictable and give us the process we were promised.
So just as a quick closure on this, and I'll be done in about a minute.
I've got to end this. I'm
okay. Your internal audit can't do this stuff. You should use externals, especially if you're thinking about any kind of litigation. You want to definitely use externals. And there's no IT auditors.
You have an IT auditor working for you?
No, we don't.
Okay, thank you.
You're not an IT auditor.
So my recommendation is you really ought to do both of these audits, okay? And given the procurement lead times and all the things you have to go through, I'd suggest you develop the RFPs in the next 2 or 3 months. Get moving on that. So I just wanted to quickly tell you what's here. You have the hard copy. I'm calling this the appendix. I'm not going to spend any time on it, but it's there for you to read. What I did is I went into the SAP contract and I found phrases and statements regarding the back end of the project. And I think the important thing here is for you to recognize is that there are a lot of handcuffs in there. There are a lot of handcuffs. One of them I told you earlier, 2,600 hours to do CAFR. Not 27, not 30, and not a promise you get them all, but just 26 hours, 2,600 hours. They're going to come back and say, we've used them all, you got to pay us more. I guarantee it's what's going to happen. Okay? And they've been pushing the CAFR down the road since, what, January? Alden, is that about right? It's just, just don't do it.
I think we've got to end this. I'm sorry, sir. Question from assembly members. Alden, any last comments by you, sir?
I just wish there'd be more smiles on the other side, but I don't smile anymore, so it doesn't matter. Thank you, sir.
I don't envy your position, Alden. You came into this thing was underwater. You've done all you can to get it above water, but it's still a challenge.
We are making progress. I know zigs tend to be negative, but we do make progress on an ongoing basis. The unfortunate, the timelines and the budget and the human resource just keeping people going, those are all challenges. They won't go away. We do make progress, and we will get the thing live, but it's taking a little bit longer. I will say that the 55-week, the July 3rd, those were estimates. I mean, SAP's the one who put the 55. We never, as a municipality, said we're going to do this in 55 weeks. That was their estimate based upon what they thought was done by Black & Veatch and Peloton. And as we've discussed, a lot of things we had to redo and everything like that. So to me, it's not unrealistic to think that once we got into it, you're going to find some things that they estimated poorly and that was going to take some longer time. That to me is the gap between May and July is that those unexpected things. We've had a lot of problems with data, as I mentioned. That's really the delay that's causing us from July to October. But we are making progress. We do continue to work on these things. We find the defects. We are moving forward. It is not as fast as we all would hope, but as I keep talking about the funnel, we started out here and we are down. You saw those things that are going green. That means those areas are getting exactly where they need to be. We're down to data and philo being our problems, and we have to unfortunately have some period of time to continue to get those yellow and then green as well. And it just keeps, we have to have all of them green before the project can go live, and that's where we're going.
I'm concerned about the contract with SAP.
Yes,
You
sir.
guys have transmitted the contract to them, they've not signed it, sent it back, or?
Zig's comment was not accurate, completely accurate. We haven't signed anything yet. We have two change orders. One that says we have $1.5 million we're putting forward. They have one that says we're giving us $5 million in investment. I have validated the items that are supposed to be in there are valid. If they took out their two stupid paragraphs that they put in at the very end, we would sign them right then and there because we'd have agreement. And they interjected those two paragraphs 3 months ago. We've said we're not doing it, and that's put us at a stalemate back and forth between their senior executives and the mayor on what we can do. So we are absolutely here, and trying to find a middle ground has been a challenge, and they will either probably relent or walk, or we try to come up with another solution, and I'm working on all three of those at the same time.
Well, you're going to be coming to give us an update for next, and we're going to be asking this question again. I also want to know what's being done on code changes, because some of this requires code changes. For example, purchasing, if they want to use a shopping cart method in there, and I've seen nothing come forward on our docket that has code changes that we have to approve.
I do know we did have some conversations to that. I also know Zig got some updates on that today as well. With regards to the potential code changes, what requires assembly, what requires the mayor. So I know they're working on it.
I just want to get them in the docket.
But I would not be surprised we're in the same position in this language when I come back. But I will be.
I believe that's
Barbara,
on.
you're working on Zig's contract for us, because I want to extend it to 30 October is.
I have that here for Zig to sign, Mr. Chair, at your direction. I also will update you. I have requested that the administration report to you. It's either before or after Zig's presentation in June. You will have a presentation from the administration on the code changes that are required to implement.
These are things we have to do by law, and you know that works. So thank you.
One quick comment, if I may. We were talking earlier, Mr. Weddleton, you were talking about, the performance audit and what's involved and why is it so much. One of the things that I would do if I were doing it is I would immediately go to the 650-page SAP quality assurance report that was generated in January of 2014. Pardon? 2015, okay. And that report said, this is the condition, this is what's good, this is what's bad, and this is how much work is necessary to do all this stuff. Okay? That's the one that said finance is 80% complete, which has been virtually completely redone. Their own quality assurance report, in my mind, hangs them. Okay? All somebody has to do is go through there and just tick them off. Just tick them off. Line item by line item by line item.
Because they want us to send the contract that says that we can't sue.
Yeah.
So could you, when you're doing things, give us a write-up on that? Just let us know exactly what you just said, so we can start looking into it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. You bet.
Anything from us, other members? This meeting's over. Thanks for being here. Sorry for the long as we took.
Thanks for your
Thank
time.
you, Zig. Thanks, Olin. Thank you, Barbara.